He stepped outside for just a minute and noticed a strange bulge in the road, warm to the touch and almost breathing from underneath. No one else saw any danger, but beneath the asphalt something was slowly building up, something that could have turned into a disaster for the entire neighborhood. Want to know what he found underground? Subscribe so you don't miss the full story, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. The morning began like any other in the courtyard of the apartment block where Alexei had lived for more than 10 years. The sun was still low enough that the buildings cast long, cold shadows across the paving stones, and the air carried the damp trace of a night rain that hadn't fully evaporated. Somewhere in the distance, a garbage truck was growling through the neighborhood, heavy and slow, its echo bouncing between the walls of the high-rises like a tired animal trapped in concrete canyons. Birds darted overhead, swift, sharp, restless shapes that never stayed in one place long enough to be studied. The world was following its usual rhythm. Nothing at first glance had shifted, and yet the moment Alexei stepped out of his building, he sensed something. Not danger, not even discomfort, just a faint disturbance in the pattern he knew too well. He took the same path every morning, the same measured steps across the courtyard, past the same benches, the same trellised patch of roses kept alive by the pensioner from the third floor, past the row of cars that always seemed frozen in the same positions. He didn't need to look where he walked. The route had long been memorized by muscle, not thought. But today his eyes were not on his car. They were drawn to the road that curved around the courtyard's exit, a familiar turn he had taken hundreds of times. Something was wrong with the asphalt. At first he thought it was an illusion, a trick of lighting or shadow. But as he came closer, the deformation revealed itself clearly, a swelling in the pavement, round and smooth, as if the roadway had been inflated from beneath. It rose like a shallow dome, almost 1.5 meters long, half a meter high, too even and too solid to be just a buckled patch of old road. 2 children from the neighboring building were jumping on top of it, laughing as it wobbled under their weight like the soft skin of some buried creature. Their mother, standing a few meters away and scrolling on her phone, didn't even look up. A delivery van had just passed through the courtyard, its tires skirting the bulge with inches to spare. Alexei paused. He felt an instinctive tightening around his shoulders, the same sensation that made him stop at work when a fuse box hummed just a little too loudly or a cable felt warmer than it should. His job had taught him something most people never learned. Danger doesn't always arrive with noise, smoke, or drama. Sometimes it simply sits there, quiet, disguised, waiting for the wrong touch. He stepped closer and pushed his shoe gently against the swollen asphalt. It gave way slightly, like tightly stretched rubber. That was the moment the first thread of unease really took hold. Asphalt wasn't supposed to behave like that. He lowered his hand, hovering a few centimeters above the surface. The warmth startled him. The air above the bulge was several degrees hotter than the rest of the morning. He straightened slowly, his mind immediately sorting through possibilities the way a trained habit sorts through tools. A fresh patch of asphalt wouldn't heat like that. From the top, maybe, if the sun had baked it long enough, but not from beneath, and the night had been cool. The only source of heat under a courtyard road like this was a pipeline, most likely a section of the city's heating main, the buried artery that pumped scalding water through miles of underground channels. He turned, scanning the edge of the courtyard the way one might search a battlefield for visible traces of the invisible. He remembered clearly now that there had once been a road crew repairing a valve behind the far building 2 years ago. He remembered the rusted iron hatch that bled heat through the snow every winter, melting it in a perfect circle even when the rest of the courtyard froze solid. He remembered the men in reflective vests complaining that the pipes in this district were older than many of the buildings above them. The heat had always been there, ignored, buried, forgotten. But this was different. A swelling of earth or asphalt was never just a cosmetic flaw. Something beneath it was moving, pushing, accumulating. Something that had already broken through whatever was supposed to contain it. A memory surfaced, sharp and unpleasant. A photo he had once seen in a report from another city roadway ruptured open, a jet of steam bursting upward like a geyser, melting plastic, burning skin, turning a sidewalk into a trap. People had walked past it just minutes before the explosion. It took only a spike in temperature, only a moment of pressure beyond tolerance. He glanced at the children again. One of them stomped hard on the top of the dome, laughing at the hollow, bouncy sound it made. The asphalt sank just slightly beneath his shoe, and Alexei saw, unmistakably, the faint tremor that went through it and returned. He took out his phone and photographed the bulge from several angles, stepping back to capture scale. He zoomed in on the tiny cracks around the edges, the faint, almost invisible hairlines where the asphalt was beginning to stretch beyond what its binder could tolerate. Each detail, he knew, could matter later, if later came at all. He didn't want to shout. He didn't want to be the man waving his arms, scaring parents into dragging their kids inside, but he also knew what it meant for a pipe to fail underground. Superheated water under pressure didn't seep. It didn't just leak. It erupted. His thoughts became sharper, faster, more mechanical. First report it. To whom? The heating supplier? The road service? The building management? In this country, every danger belonged to a department, and every department insisted it was someone else's responsibility. That was the real hazard, not the pipe itself, but the system built on delay. He walked a slow circle around the bulge. 2 cars passed close enough that he could hear the shift of their suspension as the drivers carefully threaded their wheels between the dome and the curb. He imagined a single moment of misjudgment, a wheel directly on top of the hot, stressed surface, the weight creating the final fracture through which pressure would finally escape. He didn't need to imagine the rest. He knew the temperature inside a heating pipeline. A burst of steam could sear through skin and muscle in seconds. The courtyard felt suddenly smaller, the buildings taller, the people more unaware. He felt the strange, quiet divide between those who sensed the approaching shape of disaster and those who moved through life without ever detecting the faintest tremor beneath their feet. He looked once more at the swelling in the road, then at the entrance to the school just beyond the courtyard, where the first students of the day would soon be walking. That was when he understood the same thing he always understood in the moments before a machine failed. If no one else did something, it would fall to the one who noticed. He raised his phone, opened the emergency line, and took a breath before he spoke. Even before the call connected, he already feared the answer he would receive. The call connected after 4 shrill rings, long enough to remind him how far urgency ranked in the priorities of a system that had long ago stopped believing in emergencies until they were already visible in rising smoke or broken bodies. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost lazily scripted, the kind that had answered hundreds of identical calls and forgotten all of them as soon as they were logged. Alexei described the situation as precisely as possible. The location, the shape and size of the asphalt bulge, the heat radiating through the surface, the fact that children were playing on top of it and vehicles were using the road every few minutes. He stressed the possibility of a burst in the district heating main under the courtyard. The voice responded as though none of that altered protocol. The complaint was accepted. A work order would be registered. A team would be dispatched within 3 to 7 business days, depending on workload and route scheduling. He could almost hear the shrug through the phone. He repeated calmly this time, almost clinically, that this was not a cosmetic road defect, that a pressurized cavity had already formed and was expanding, that a rupture could occur with no warning. If the asphalt hasn't cracked and there's no visible steam, the dispatcher answered, it isn't classified as an emergency, only as a structural irregularity. The conversation ended with a reference number, a polite farewell, and a silence that felt heavier than denial. It felt like abandonment. He stood for a moment with the phone still in his hand, the courtyard now shifting into a different kind of focus. What he had just witnessed wasn't ignorance. It was procedure. A problem wasn't real until the system lost control of it. Everything before that moment was merely suggestion, and suggestion could be filed, postponed, delegated, misplaced, anything except acted upon. He tried the municipal road service next. The reply was more defensive than dismissive. The bulge was not a road defect but a subsurface fault, which made it the responsibility of the heating supplier. The heating supplier, by contrast, had made it clear that if the asphalt was still intact, the situation belonged to the road service. He made a third call to the building's management company, who informed him that anything located outside the foundation perimeter of the structure was not under their authority. If he believed the issue threatened safety, he should contact emergency response services. Emergency response services, in turn, referred him back to the heating supplier. It was a circle so perfectly constructed that it didn't even feel malicious anymore, just permanent, like a cliff face carved by generations of neglect rather than one act of intent. He walked back toward the bulge and noticed how the morning had changed. The sun was rising higher, warming the top of the dome, and the asphalt seemed to reflect light differently now, as if a subtle film of moisture had formed across its curve. It was no longer just warm when he placed his hand over it. It was radiating heat. And as he crouched and watched the surface carefully, he noticed something else. A faint fracture line, a thin white seam, the width of a strand of hair tracing from the top of the bulge toward its base. Asphalt did not bend indefinitely. It stretched only as long as the tension allowed it to remain whole. He looked across the courtyard again. A teenager on an electric scooter shot toward the road, curved effortlessly up the side of the bulge as if it were a skate ramp, and launched downward laughing as the wheels slapped onto the even pavement beyond. The asphalt trembled visibly under the impact. The rider sped away oblivious. Not once did he turn back to see what had moved beneath him. On the opposite side of the courtyard, a group of neighbors had gathered, watching without watching. Some filmed the bulge with their phones, but it was the kind of filming meant for amusement, not documentation. Someone joked that the city must be pregnant with another road repair. Someone else guessed it was probably nothing but bad asphalt. They spoke in the tone people used when danger was too abstract to feel real. That was when a larger realization settled into him. Not about the threat itself, but about its invisibility. A hazard no one recognized was a hazard no one avoided. And if no one avoided it, it would sooner or later claim someone who hadn't even been given the right to decide whether they were walking into danger. The calls he had made proved something. If he did not act, nothing would happen except waiting. And waiting in cases like this was not neutral. Pressure underground did not remain stable. Moisture eroded soil, expanding the cavity beneath the asphalt. Heat fluctuations created cycles of expansion and contraction in the metal pipe. One bad hour of internal stress, one sudden spike in temperature, and the ground would simply give way. Not gradually, not politely, catastrophically. He went back into the building and down into the basement storage area where residents kept tools, bicycles, crates of forgotten items. He found the box where he kept the drill he used for repairs at work. The heavy industrial kind meant for concrete and steel, with an assortment of drill bits stored in a separate pouch. He tested the cable, checked the chuck, tested the motor briefly against a wall to feel for vibration wobble. Everything worked. He chose a narrow bit of pilot size, thin enough to pierce but not to shatter, and slipped it inside a side pocket of his jacket. He paused before leaving. He wasn't rushing out in panic. Everything he did had a reason. He understood how to test a line, how to puncture a pressurized surface without forcing a rupture. He knew that if he bored a small, angled hole from the side of the bulge, not the top, he could release whatever was inside gradually, just enough to determine whether it was water, gas, air, or steam. A test hole, a diagnostic. The same way he worked with sealed conduits at his job, he did not intend to fix the problem, but he could confirm it. And once confirmed, once recorded, once undeniable, even the most stubborn dispatcher would have no place left to hide. He stepped outside again and saw that the courtyard had entered the late morning cycle. More traffic, more movement, more risk. The street that bordered the courtyard carried the muffled growl of delivery vans and school buses turning in. The quiet hour was ending. Time, which had felt abundant at dawn, was tightening. As he approached the bulge, he noticed something new. Another fracture, this one barely visible but running farther across the crown. And just where the shadow fell against the pavement, he saw a bead of water, small but persistent, gathering at the edge of the seam. Not rainwater, not surface condensation. Water from within. He crouched, studying it for a long breath, and his conviction solidified. The earth below was no longer holding pressure. The bulge was beginning to deform not from force below, but from structural collapse within. The cavity was enlarging. The crust above was thinning. He looked at his watch, then at the school entrance across the courtyard. In less than an hour, streams of children would pass through here again, many on bicycles, some running, some chasing each other blindly across the road. That was the moment he knew he had crossed from concern into responsibility. Not assigned responsibility, not delegated responsibility, the kind that chooses you the instant you recognize the truth others refuse to see. He lifted the drill. He was going to act not because he was entitled to, but because there was no one else who would. The chapter ended there, not in resolution, but in decision, the kind that changes the shape of everything that happens after. He walked toward the bulge, the drill hanging at his side like a question only he was willing to answer. The drill felt heavier in his hand than it had in the basement, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. It was no longer just a tool. It was a line he was about to cross between observer and participant, between concern and intervention. The courtyard did not know that anything had changed, but for him, the moment had already shifted. The point of no return was not when he pressed the trigger. It was when he decided that silence and waiting were no longer acceptable. The bulge in the asphalt stood in the same place, but it no longer looked harmless. The cracks along its sides had lengthened, now forming a subtle spiderweb spreading downward, like stress fractures in ceramic under pressure. The sun had warmed the road, and the top of the dome now shimmered faintly with heat, making the surrounding air distort in a wavering haze. The bead of water he had noticed earlier was still there, but now it was joined by a second and a third, forming a wet streak that slid slowly toward the gutter. The ground beneath was no longer sealed. It was exhaling. He took time to think before doing anything. That was essential. Not rushing, not acting on impulse. Every movement was deliberate. First, he expanded the improvised barrier he had arranged earlier, moving 2 large trash bins so they blocked the driveway fully, pulling a length of caution tape taut between them, then weighting the tape down with bricks to keep it from fluttering loose. A delivery van appeared at the entrance to the courtyard, hesitated, then backed away when it saw the obstruction. Already he was interfering with the flow of daily life. Already he could imagine complaints forming in the minds of people who did not yet know what lay beneath the surface they drove on. He scanned for witnesses. A few residents watched from balconies, leaning out lazily, curious but unalarmed. One man filmed with his phone, not because he understood anything, but because something was happening. The children who had been playing earlier were gone, and he was grateful for that. He didn't want an audience for what he was about to attempt, not because he feared being questioned, but because he feared being distracted. He positioned himself at the lower edge of the bulge, not at the peak. The center was where the asphalt carried the most tension, where a single puncture might act like a needle against a balloon. What he needed was an angled entry on the side, where the slope was shallower, where the pressure would not be forced upward immediately. He knelt, placed the drill bit against the surface, and leaned his weight over it to feel the contact. The asphalt was still firm, but he could feel the hollow beneath, the difference between drilling into solid ground and drilling into a shell suspended over emptiness. He braced himself, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The first seconds were familiar. The vibration of the drill, the steady grind of bit against pavement, flecks of grain and dust spitting outward in a widening ring. But then, much sooner than expected, resistance simply stopped. The drill slid forward almost too easily, the bit sinking into nothing. He had reached the cavity. And then it happened. The drill's metal shaft began to heat so quickly that even through the handle he could feel the change. The air around the bit shimmered, and a jet of vapor burst outward through the hole he had made. The sound was not a whistle. It was a hiss, forceful and wet, the sound of steam escaping from something deep and under pressure. The stream shot sideways at first, then curled upward, carrying with it a faint, bitter smell of heated soil and rusted metal. The asphalt around the opening darkened as moisture soaked into it. The drill bit, still spinning when he instinctively released the trigger, began to glow a dull amber at its tip. He pulled back fast, dropping the drill onto the pavement and stepping away in the same motion. His hands were shaking, not with fear but with confirmation. The cavity beneath the asphalt was not filled with air. It wasn't just water either. It was filled with pressurized steam, hot enough to boil skin instantly, steam that had been trapped long enough to build a chamber, capable of lifting half a metric ton of roadway upward like a stretched drumhead. The opening he had drilled was small, no wider than a cigarette, but the steam kept pouring through it in a tight, continuous stream, like breath forced through clenched teeth. He crouched to watch it at a distance, and the truth settled into him with the weight of certainty. If a child had jumped hard enough, if a single car tire had landed directly on the apex, if one crack in the asphalt had widened just a centimeter more, the pressure could have forced its way out violently. And when steam exploded, it did not drift, it scalded. It did not warn, it consumed. He stood up slowly and scanned the courtyard again. Nothing had changed on the surface. Nothing ever did. A woman was pulling her grocery cart toward the building entrance. A jogger passed by the perimeter of the courtyard wearing headphones, oblivious. Life moved on as though the ground under it was not slowly preparing to fail. The drill lay where he had dropped it, the bit still faintly smoking. He retrieved it with gloved hands and unplugged the power cable. The metal was so hot he could feel the heat radiating through the fabric. If he had drilled for just a few seconds longer, the bit might have fused in the asphalt, and the pressure might have forced the drill out of his grip violently. He had stopped just in time. He backed up, widened the perimeter even farther, and forced himself to think not about what had just happened, but about what had almost happened. He imagined a delivery truck hitting the bulge at speed, forcing the rupture downward instead of upward, turning the whole layer of pavement into shrapnel. He imagined a group of school children walking in a cluster as the steam vented upward into their faces. He imagined the aftermath ambulances, news headlines, official statements full of passive verbs. The incident occurred. The situation escalated. The investigation is ongoing. No mention of the warnings ignored. No mention of the quiet signals noticed only by one pair of eyes. He took photos again of the drilled opening, of the escaping steam, of the wet stain forming across the pavement. There was no argument anyone could make now that this was anything less than imminent danger. The physical evidence was undeniable, and yet he already knew what the next obstacle would be. Proof did not guarantee action. The system would respond only if forced to respond. As he stood there, a teenager approached on a bicycle, slowing when he noticed the tape and bins. He seemed annoyed at first, then curious, then impatient when he realized the obstruction meant a detour. Alexei raised a hand and gestured sharply away, pointing first at the bulge, then at the venting steam. The boy squinted, shrugged, and turned back. No understanding, no questions, no thanks. Just inconvenience avoided. That moment told him everything. The risk wasn't only what lay under the asphalt. The true risk was disbelief, the kind that let people step into danger not because they were reckless, but because they assumed someone else would have warned them properly if it were real. He put the drill away and picked up his phone again, preparing to make another round of calls, this time with proof. Not speculation, not suspicion, evidence. They would not be able to dismiss him now, but he also knew something else. Something he felt in his spine rather than his thoughts. The situation was evolving. Pressure was still building underground. The hole he had made was releasing some of it, but not nearly enough. That meant only one thing. Time had not stopped working against them. It was accelerating, and the next hour would decide whether the courtyard remained quiet or became the site of a disaster people would later say had come out of nowhere. He knew better. It was already here. The steam continued to escape through the narrow opening he had drilled. But instead of reassuring him, the steady hiss deepened his sense of urgency. The pressure was no longer rising as quickly as before, but it was not dissipating either. It was simply venting enough to keep the bulge from bursting immediately, like a warning breath pushed out through clenched teeth. The cavity beneath the asphalt had not collapsed. The pipe was still leaking. The water was still boiling. The danger had not passed. It had only been exposed. More people began to move through the courtyard now that the morning had reached its liveliest hour. Cars rolled slowly toward the exit, pausing in confusion at the barricade he had created. A mother pushed a stroller toward the school entrance. Two boys on scooters came speeding down the walkway with no intention of slowing down. The quiet, nearly empty atmosphere that had allowed him to act was over. Now the courtyard was returning to its function as a shared artery of movement, a place where people passed through without thinking, without looking, without knowing. Every person entering the space made the risk heavier. He stepped forward and blocked the boys with a raised hand, pointing toward the steam vent. They stared for a second, then veered away, muttering something he couldn't hear. The mother with the stroller paused, puzzled, but moved on once she realized she could avoid the dome by walking a few paces farther left. No one protested yet. No one asked questions. No one thanked him. It was not gratitude he wanted. It was recognition of the threat. But that was the one thing the human mind resisted until danger became visible in a dramatic form. He widened the barricade again, dragging a pair of storage pallets from behind the trash bins and placing them at angles that forced pedestrians to alter their path. He set down a bucket filled with tap water next to the bulge knot, because it would help if the rupture was violent, but because people instinctively respected the visual presence of tools, as if they confirmed that work was being done. He tied another strand of caution tape between the pallets and the concrete planter, making the perimeter clearer. The heat from the vented steam warmed his face even from a distance. He could feel the pulse of it, like breath from a furnace beneath the ground. He checked his phone for a response to the second round of reports he had sent. Photos, details, timestamps, the words immediate danger and public risk included in every message. Nothing. Not a single callback, not a single alert. He dialed again, this time not to the dispatcher, but to the emergency line used for gas leaks, accidents, and threats to public safety. That operator did not dismiss him as quickly, but the process was no faster. They would escalate the request. A technician would be assigned as soon as available. No estimate, no urgency, just the same bureaucratic phrases wrapped in a tone carefully trained to sound calm. He hung up before she finished her rehearsed reassurance. Now the steam was forming a visible plume above the hole, a thin, wavering thread of white against the rising morning light. The asphalt around the drilled point glistened darker than before, as if the surface itself had begun to soften. The fracture lines were spreading, the web of stress increasing not just in length, but in depth. The dome was losing stability. Every minute counted. He walked over to the children gathering outside the school gate and positioned himself like an invisible wall between them and the danger. His motions were direct, controlled gesturing gently but firmly, redirecting traffic to the inside curb. A few parents looked annoyed, but once they noticed the barricade and the strange heat rising off the asphalt, they moved along without resistance. Some cast quick glances back at him, trying to understand what they had just avoided. None lingered long enough to ask. The sound of a bicycle chain clicked behind him, and he turned in time to see a teenage boy pedaling fast toward the bulge. The boy hadn't noticed the barricade, hadn't registered the tape, hadn't seen the steam. The world ahead of him existed in motion only. Alexei stepped into his path and raised both arms in a clear blocking gesture. The tires skidded. The bike slowed. The boy nearly swerved into a patch of gravel. He yelled something reflexively, more startled than angry. Alexei pointed hard at the swollen asphalt, then at the steam. The boy's expression changed in an instant surprise, then confusion, then a slow, reluctant understanding. He nodded once, pushed off, and rode away along the far edge of the courtyard. That was the moment Alexei understood how fragile the distance was between safety and disaster. It wasn't measured in meters. It was measured in seconds, in unthinking footsteps, in the speed of a bicycle, in the bounce of a child's shoe. Even a single interruption, one raised hand, one diverted path, could be the difference between life and injury. Or worse. He checked the bulge again. The dome was beginning to sag at the top, the first sign that the cavity beneath was changing shape. Pressure had stopped lifting the asphalt upward and had begun to hollow it from below. That meant the rupture, when it came, might not explode upward like a geyser. It might collapse downward, sucking the surface into the cavity before releasing a jet of steam in all directions. That kind of failure happened fast, with no warning sound, no visible cue until it was already too late. He imagined footsteps hitting the thinning surface, and his stomach tightened. He dialed again. This time, he didn't wait for the operator's opening line. He used the words that mattered: danger to children, public roadway failure, scalding hazard, active steam release, potential explosion. He didn't shout, but he spoke with controlled force, each sentence shaped like a warning signal. There was a pause on the other end, a different kind of silence. Then a promise that a crew would be dispatched with priority. He didn't know if that meant 20 minutes or 2 hours. But it was the first shift in tone he had heard all morning. The courtyard was fully awake now. People waited at the bus stop near the road, glancing vaguely at the barricade, assuming that anything roped off was simply under repair. Still no panic. Still no full comprehension. And that, he knew, was the hardest stage of danger, the stage where nothing had happened yet, but everything was ready to. He stood guard, not because someone had asked him to, but because no one else knew they needed guarding from anything at all. At last, a faint rumble of a diesel engine rolled toward the courtyard. Not a bus, not a delivery truck, a utility vehicle, white with faded blue stripes, carrying a mounted flashing light not yet switched on. He didn't relax. Not yet. He only stepped back from the barricade and prepared to point them to the wound in the ground he had been protecting. Everything that would happen now depended not on what he had already done, but on whether those arriving would finally see what he had seen hours earlier. The danger was no longer hidden, but that did not mean it was over. The utility truck rolled into the courtyard with the slow, steady weight of something that had finally been forced into motion. The men inside did not appear rushed. There were no sirens, no urgency in their faces, just the practiced weariness of people who had answered countless calls that sounded dramatic, but turned out harmless. They stepped out in uniforms marked with the emblem of the district heating service, carrying tool bags and clipboards instead of stretchers or extinguishers. To them, this was still just another job. Alexei met them halfway, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. He pointed toward the barricaded area, the still steaming puncture he had drilled, the widening cracks in the road surface. One of the workers walked closer, bent down with a handheld thermometer, and aimed it at the asphalt. The device beeped twice. The man looked down at the reading, frowned slightly, then aimed it again, as if the numbers might change if given a chance. He did the same along different points of the bulge, then finally lifted his head and exchanged a look with the others. Something in their posture changed, just a fraction. It was the first sign that they were beginning to understand this wasn't routine. More instruments came out, one to test for gas, another to measure surface pressure, another to read the thermal gradient across the asphalt. They spoke quietly among themselves, using technical shorthand for pipe seams, pressure variance, failure loads. One of them followed the small trail of water leading from the base of the bulge to the gutter and crouched to examine the soil. When he looked up, there was no more doubt in his face. The seal had failed below. The ground beneath the asphalt was gone, eroded, hollowed out, replaced by a pocket of heat and vapor, large enough to lift the road like a blister. A decision was made quickly then. The man who seemed to be in charge took out a two-way radio and called for emergency excavation clearance. The tone of his voice was different now, sharp, clipped, the tone of someone who had moved from protocol into response. The crew no longer acted like workers assembling a checklist. They moved like people aware that time was a factor, that something could still go wrong if the wrong weight or the wrong vibration hit the wrong spot. They widened the perimeter even farther than Alexei had. They brought out metal stands and heavy reflective barricades from the back of the truck, the kind that were meant not just for blocking, but for warning. For the first time, passers-by paused not just with curiosity, but with unease. The presence of official equipment, the kind not used unless something was truly dangerous, communicated what no amount of pointing or speaking ever could. Danger didn't become real to the public until it was marked with symbols they understood. When a second vehicle arrived, this one carrying a portable cutting unit and a steel drill rig, it was no longer possible for anyone in the courtyard to pretend the problem was trivial. The workers unloaded the machinery and set it beside the dome, like surgeons preparing instruments for an operation. One of them approached Alexei and asked a few questions, not out of politeness, but because they needed the timeline of the problem. When had he first noticed the bulge? When had the asphalt begun to heat? How strong was the pressure when he drilled? Had steam been constant or pulsing? They didn't comment on the fact that he had drilled into the surface himself. They didn't thank him, but they also didn't scold him or dismiss him. They treated him like a witness who understood exactly what he had seen. He stepped back and watched as they began their work. First came the controlled pressure release, more drilled vents, angled carefully, spaced in a pattern designed to reduce the internal buildup without fracturing the surface too quickly. Each hole sent up a sharp white jet of steam, much stronger than the one he had created earlier. The heat was intense enough that the men used shields and gloves, and every time a new vent opened, the surrounding workers stepped back instinctively. Someone watching from the sidelines sucked in a breath as one of the vents screamed upward, visibly warping the air around it like a flare. Next came the cutting. A powered asphalt saw carved a thick semicircle into the dome, the blades spitting sparks and black dust as it bit through the heated surface. When the arc was complete, two men pried the segment upward with crowbars, and what had been hidden beneath finally became visible. Steam roared out of the opening in a violent breath, not upward this time, but outward, spreading in a white cloud that rolled low across the road and dissipated into the air, like fog retreating from sunlight. Beneath the lifted asphalt lay not soil, but a dark, slick cavity of mud and eroded sand, wide enough for a person to crawl into, deep enough that the bottom wasn't immediately visible. A tunnel of heat, a void created by months of leaking water that had boiled and scoured the ground away grain by grain. The pipe that had caused it was visible through the gap, its surface mottled with rust, its insulation shredded and blackened, its metal flaking as if eaten by fire from within. The welded seam along the lower edge had ruptured, leaving a narrow slit from which the water had sprayed into the ground until pressure and temperature turned it into vapor. Someone shone a flashlight into the cavity. The beam reflected off damp metal and dripping mineral deposits that had formed long, thin crusts like the stalactites of a cave. No one spoke for a moment, not because they were shocked, but because the truth was so clear there was nothing left to speculate. The cavity had been growing for months. The pipe had failed long before the asphalt showed any sign. If the soil layer above it had given way just a little faster, or the pressure had spiked a little farther, the entire road could have collapsed without warning under the weight of a vehicle or a cluster of pedestrians. The lead technician began dictating the official incident record, noting the compromised weld seam, the condition of the pipe, the eroded subgrade, the evidence of long-term leakage, and the imminent risk of rupture. He mentioned almost offhandedly that the section had been listed for replacement in the next scheduled maintenance cycle. That cycle was still months away. One of the workers paused, looked at Alexei, and said in a low voice that didn't match the tone he had used before, "If that had blown while someone was standing on it." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement Alexei would receive. The crew began setting up the next phase shutting down the section of the pipeline, draining the pressure load, preparing to cut away the damaged portion. The courtyard would be without heat and hot water for at least a day. People would complain later, but none of them would know how close they had come to something worse than inconvenience. A few neighbors approached now, not with irritation, but with quiet questions. What happened? Was it dangerous? Could it have exploded? Alexei let the workers answer. It was no longer his place. His part had ended the moment the professionals arrived and took control. Yet he remained near the barricade, not out of necessity, but because he couldn't leave until the ground was no longer holding its breath beneath them. He had seen the truth hidden under the street, and he needed to see it sealed again, not just physically, but in the kind of memory that prevented the next hazard from being ignored until it screamed. Now the reality was visible. Now the danger was recorded. Now the negligence could not be denied. It should not have required a man with a drill to prove it, but it had, and that, more than the ruptured pipe, was the part that lingered. By the time the repair crew finished stabilizing the site and sealing off the damaged pipeline, the courtyard had changed. The heat that once pulsed invisibly beneath the asphalt was gone, replaced by the neutral coolness of exposed earth and equipment. The bulging dome of roadway, the one that had threatened to rupture with a single careless step, had been cut apart, stacked, hauled away in pieces. What remained was a rectangular wound in the ground, open, damp, stripped of its disguise. People walked past it with a cautious curiosity now, not because they understood what it had been, but because they sensed, in a way they hadn't earlier, that danger had been here and that it had been real. News of the incident spread faster than he expected. Before the afternoon ended, a local reporter appeared with a camera crew and a microphone, asking the workers for statements. When one of them gestured toward Alexei and said, "He's the one who found it," the reporter turned the camera toward him and asked the questions she already knew the answers to. How did he notice it? What made him act? Had he known how serious it was? Her voice was eager, but her questions were framed for a version of the story that was simpler than the truth. She wanted a clean headline, a clear hero, a single moment of revelation. He answered plainly, without drama, without embellishment. He said that he had noticed something wrong, that he had contacted the services, that no one came, that he acted before it became dangerous. She wanted to know whether he felt like a hero. He told her no, only responsible. By evening, the video was already circulating online. Comment sections filled with arguments between people who praised him and others who insisted he had taken unnecessary risks, that he should have waited for professionals, that he could have made things worse. Still others bypassed the situation entirely and argued about the state of public infrastructure, the failures of management companies, the decay of the city, the taxes people paid but never saw return. The courtyard, once just a place residents walked through without noticing, had become a talking point for people who had never stood there at all. The next day brought something different. An email from the building's management company, formal, impersonal, reminding residents that unauthorized modifications to shared property are prohibited and that any interaction with municipal systems must be performed only by licensed contractors. It did not mention what had been prevented. It did not mention the 6 months of ignored complaints the crew had discovered in the maintenance log. It did not mention that the same company had dismissed the first warning call with a template response. It only reminded him and everyone else that what he had done was not permitted. But something else arrived as well. A handwritten note slipped into the entrance hall, taped beside the elevator buttons, signed by no one but visible to all. "Thank you to the man who stopped this from becoming a tragedy." Beneath it were signatures, 10 at first, then 20, then more each day, from people who had not been there when the dome swelled, who had not seen the steam burst through the drill hole, who had not felt the heat pulsing through the pavement, but who now understood or believed enough to acknowledge. A week passed. The cavity beneath the road was filled with packed gravel, then layered soil, then a new slab of asphalt laid flat and smooth as if nothing had ever happened. Children walked over it again. Cars passed without slowing. The only sign of what had occurred was a faint line of new tar along the cut. The quiet kind of scar the city carried everywhere, unnoticed until someone happened to care enough to look closely. He walked past it often, not because he needed to, but because he could not let himself forget. There was no plaque, no marker, no record except the one held in memory, and the incident report archived somewhere in a file no one would read unless another pipe burst in another courtyard years from now. The city had swallowed the danger, patched it, repaved it, and moved on. That was not a failure. It was a rhythm. Crisis, repair, forgetting. But he had not forgotten. He remembered the moment when the drill bit turned red with heat. He remembered the hiss of escaping steam, the spiderweb cracks forming across the surface, the weight of what might have happened if a school bus had passed a little earlier, or a child had jumped a little harder, or the ground had softened a little more. He remembered not the disaster that occurred, but the one that almost did. It was a strange kind of relief, knowing that nothing had happened. No headlines about burns, no ambulances, no sirens, no grieving families demanding to know why no one had noticed the danger in time. But the absence of tragedy did not erase the truth that it had been possible, and that the only reason it wasn't real was because one person had stopped long enough to notice what everyone else had walked past. He thought then about the way danger hides not in explosions, but in the quiet hours before them. The most terrifying catastrophes are not the ones that erupt without warning. They are the ones that send warnings no one hears, or worse, the ones people hear but choose to ignore. One morning, as he passed the newly paved road, he noticed something subtle but unmistakable. Frost covered the courtyard in a thin white sheet, but the patch of road above the repaired pipe was dry. The snow melted into a dark oval of bare pavement. The new pipe gave off heat, not enough to be dangerous, just enough to reveal itself. He stood there a moment, studying the warm patch among the frost, the way it sat like a faint reminder beneath the surface. Everything beneath their feet had returned to ordinary function, but he knew better than to believe that danger was gone from the world. It had only shifted, waiting for the next place where people would fail to see it until it was almost too late. He walked on, not as a hero, not as a witness, but as someone who had learned the cost of assuming that someone else would notice first. That was the truth. No repair could seal beneath asphalt. The explosion had never happened, but the lesson had. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. And if you're ready for more stories like this, watch the next video right here. You won't regret it.